You're listening to the Fighting Irish Faithful podcast, a podcast that is powered by Scotch and spreadsheets. Thank you, everyone, for joining me on this, the second week of Advent. Tonight, we will discuss Marcus Freeman, give him a lot more praise as we enter into the era with him at the helm. Of course, we'll do a little bit of Brian Kelly bashing because, hell, why not? And we'll look at past Notre Dame head coaches, how they have fared in their first few games, look at why Notre Dame is not in the playoffs and should they be in the playoffs, and a little bit of preview of the Fiesta Bowl, but not a whole lot. We will not blow our wad on that. We will wait until next week for that detailed preview against Notre Dame versus the Cowboys. So sit back, relax, pour yourself a drink, and let's go, Irish.
Three wide receivers right. They're going to go for two. Back to throw. Walsh looks, has the time, lost the ball. The pass is batted down. It's batted down by Carroll.
Dawson throws, open receiver in the end zone. Touchdown, Notre Dame. Somehow, the Irish did it.
Out of the pack, 30, 35. Goodbye, baby. At the 50, the 40, the 30, the 20, the 10. Five, rocket touchdown, Irish.
Zibikowski looking for a block. Touch to the right to the 40. Gets a block, gets to the 45, 50. Up to the 45, 40, 30. One man to beat. 20, 15, 10. He's done to the 5. Touchdown, Irish.
What's going on, Fighting Irish Faithful? Welcome to the Fighting Irish Faithful show. Thank you for joining me on today, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. Yes, a holy day of obligation. So if you're listening to this and you didn't go to Mass, you need to get right with the Lord and go to confession. But it's Advent, and you should be going to confession anyway. Really should go to confession as much as you possibly can, because I genuinely care about your spirituality, your soul, and all of that. But enough with the preaching here. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. But hey, I'm going to go on a limb and say this is a Catholic podcast because we talk about Notre Dame, and I'm a Catholic person, so why not? Notre Dame's a Catholic university, but we primarily talk about football, and tonight we'll take no exception to that. If you're new to the show, welcome. We are a friendly place where we drink scotch, and we have some numbers and data powered by spreadsheets. Thank you, Bill Gates and Microsoft Excel, for making this podcast possible. So we've had a pretty whirlwind of the last couple weeks. The last two episodes have been very uncharacteristic, probably also resulting in multiple new people that are joining the show. So if you're new, this is going to be a little different from what you're used to hearing. We are primarily just myself. This is at faithful_Irish on the Twitter, or on Gmail at fightingirishfaithful@gmail.com. There's also the YouTube channel, which you can just search for Fighting Irish Faithful. I come up. iTunes, Spotify, all those places. The Fighting Irish Faithful show is where we are at. In Season 2, Episode 20, the last two episodes have had my brother, West Coast Irish, and at Red Snapper 9098. He's doing some other good things right now. He's helping some very close friends of his set up some Christmas decorations and just help around the house. So we give a toast, and the toast is to my brother, Red Snapper 9098. You've helped the show get to kind of a different level, kind of take on a different format, and just kind of keep things different, keep it interesting. So to my brother, cheers. Yes, we do drink a beverage, and tonight we're doing a DeWars White Label. So felt like we needed to do something new. We're kind of in the new era here, so it kind of makes sense that we would have a new scotch going into the Marcus Freeman era. So speaking of Marcus Freeman, if you have not seen the introductory video of him with his players when it was first announced in the locker room, they practically tackle him, do a mosh pit. It's absolutely fantastic. Check my timeline, but just search on the internet, you'll find it. It's quite spectacular. seeing the positive reception of him as the new head coach of Notre Dame football and seeing Marcus Freeman up there. It really, really sparked some energy. Someone on Twitter was having a bad day, and I just said, hey, it's really not that bad, and I sent him a picture of Marcus Freeman, and I hope it cheered that person up, among other people. So no matter what's going on in the world right now, we do have a good man in charge of our football team. Now, his success is to be determined. He needs to coach some games as the head coach, and we'll see what happens. So more to come on that. But in addition to that, there was a formal press conference on Monday with him accepting the role and just from some formalities with the media, him addressing questions from the media and whatnot. And I won't go into too many details of his speech, but you can tell his responses were genuine. They were from the heart. He was humbled yet determined and ready for the challenge. So definitely speaks to what it means to be the head coach of Notre Dame. In addition to that, I really think he understands and gets Notre Dame. He gets it. He's not an alum. He is relatively new to the Notre Dame family. But as the head coach, he embraces what Notre Dame is about. Yes, there's plenty of history. Yes, we have a storied past, and we're part of the conversation, it seems, every year, regardless of whether or not we're successful or not. But especially now, the last few years that Notre Dame has been successful, he is now doing a very good job of being able to take what was built over the last decade, take it to the next level. So the first thing he's doing as the new head coach is he's on the recruiting trail. He's already visiting guys, and he's trying to take those 4 and 5 star guys who are really very football minded and then saying, look, you can come to Notre Dame also and benefit in these other ways. And I think he has a much more personable way of connecting to players. Notre Dame does recruit itself, but sometimes you need someone like him to really say, look, this is the guy. So he's out there recruiting. Hopefully he has some success out there. But then he will be ultimately preparing the current team, because it is still 2021. We have one more game left, and that is against the Cowboys of Oklahoma State. So we will see if Marcus Freeman in one game, his first game, can do what Brian Kelly was never able to do at Notre Dame, and so far has never been able to do in his career, and that's win a big bowl game that matters, win a New Year's Six. So to Marcus Freeman, best wishes to you, sir. Beat the crap out of your team now. They are yours. You need to certainly drill down and demand excellence and execution, because this podcast here will do the same to you and Notre Dame no matter what. And the reason for that is Notre Dame expected the exact same thing from me when I was a student there. So, moving on. Since Brian Kelly was never able to do what Marcus Freeman now has the opportunity to do, let's just go ahead and do some more Brian Kelly bashing. The more I think of how he left, I am so confident in that yes, he's gone. I have zero reservations that this is the right thing. It's kind of like a bad breakup that at first you're shocked, but then you realize, like, wow, I feel better. This wound has now been plucked away from me, and I'm able to heal and move on into the right direction. And not that Brian Kelly was just this, pestilence that was running all over Notre Dame football. No, and I've given Kelly praise in the past about modernizing the program, going with turf and a jumbotron and things of that nature. But that's not the standard of this podcast. That we demand excellence, and quite frankly, I want a New Year's Six. I want a Fiesta Bowl. That's what's on the horizon. Kelly's never been able to do it. So, but Brian Kelly's got some problems even still at LSU. In addition to just him doing fake Southern accents and his team just looking at him with a deer in the headlights kind of approach when he meets them, he's got players now leaving his program. The starting quarterback of LSU, Max Johnson, has transferred out or entered the transfer portal from LSU. What does that say? Well, I'll tell you what it says. This guy is looking at Kelly's record, especially at Notre Dame, and looking at all of the guys who have transferred out. There are more quarterbacks who have transferred out of Notre Dame under the helm of Brian Kelly than that stayed in and graduated and whatnot. I can only think on one hand the number of guys who actually saw significant playing time and who stayed. But listen to this list of guys who played significant playing time to an extent under Kelly and transferred out. Now, not all of these guys saw great amounts of time on the field, but they were part of the fold and did transfer. Dane Christ, Andrew Hendricks, Gunnar Kiel, although he didn't see a single snap, but still he was a 5-star recruit. Everett Golson, Malik Zaire, Brandon Wimbush, Phil Dracovic, and most recently Brendan Clark. Now, Clark is kind of late, maybe that's right around the time that Kelly leaves, and he was kind of going to be third string at best next season behind Buckner and Drew Pine, to be determined if Drew Pine is going to transfer, but I really don't think he will. He's a guaranteed, backup to Buckner most likely. And so we'll see what happens there. But these are the guys who have left Notre Dame under Kelly and sought greener pastures in other schools and other places. And Max Johnson is just the latest casualty of the Kelly quarterback transfer legacy. In my opinion, I think he's making a really, really good decision. So we'll see what happens with BK and LSU. His first game is against Kansas State in their bowl game. But you know what? We'll see. I think half of Notre Dame Nation will be watching that game, very curious to see how he performs in one game. Now, granted, it's a bowl game. He's been with the team, but he'll have, close to a month to prepare his new team. So who knows how much chemistry he can really, fix or implement. But hey, it is what it is. So that being said, though, I did some show prep and went back to an episode I recorded last year. If you're new, in season 1, the 5th episode I ever did, I gave a lot of grief to Kelly. Now, this was before 2020 season started, okay, before going undefeated and making the playoffs and going to an ACC championship game. Before that season even started, I looked at the previous 10 years, and the episode is titled Dissecting Brian Kelly's Previous 10 Years at Notre Dame. I will link that in the description of the show, but I essentially look at anything from Kelly's worst losses, his worst margins of defeat. I do a lot of comparison to him and Lou Holtz because Holtz was there for about 11 seasons, so it seemed only reasonable and fair to compare him to Kelly as he entered his 11th season at the time. Anything from why Kelly wasn't getting done, and was very macro about it, didn't get into the nitty-gritty. The nitty-gritty was reserved for last episode, and last episode, just talking about Kelly's personality, his slimy, sleazy politician persona, anything from just his lack of motivation of his players or even connection and availability to players. I didn't talk too much about that last season, but was very macro and looked straight at the record of Brian Kelly, how he's performing in these games, why he's getting blown out, and not getting blown out like in the early days of his career at Notre Dame. He was getting blown out by teams in the later years, 2017 Miami, Michigan 2019, anything from the ACC championship game against Clemson. These are big games and recent games where he goes on the road or whatnot and he loses. And I, quite frankly, was very disappointed and unhappy with that and gave him a ton of grief. Now, I also got a little sloshed and a little mouthy at the same time. So if you want a good laugh and you want to go down the rabbit hole a little bit onto what this show is really about, it's very, very stat heavy, but stay with it. There's some clever stuff going on there. So episode 5, dissecting Brian Kelly's previous 10 years at Notre Dame. Check it out, because quite frankly, Notre Dame's not playing this weekend, and you'll be finishing up doing your Christmas decorations, writing Christmas cards and whatnot, and you'll need something to listen to pass the time. So one thing I wanted to look at is a little bit more of Brian Kelly bashing, which is the biggest stain upon him other than just the way he left. And that's when push came to shove, having a decent season, when you get to the big game at the end of the year, the Cotton Bowl, the BCS championship game, Fiesta Bowl, it doesn't matter. He never was able to close the deal. And this is very troubling and troublesome for me personally, because Notre Dame hasn't won a game that matters since 1994. I will continue to harp on this until Marcus Freeman does it or the next coach. I don't care. This is what matters. All right. I'm not interested in winning the Sun Bowl. The Music City Bowl with Malik Zaire is one of my favorite bowl games that Notre Dame has ever won. But at the end of the day, you look at big picture, does it truly matter? And I would argue no. Now, if Notre Dame had won that bowl, then in 2015 won the Fiesta Bowl over Ohio State and Urban Meyer, then okay, we could have said that was a noticeable line in the sand where Kelly had transformed the team, done something different with Malik Zaire and heavy run offense and whatnot. And then we move into 2015 with CJ Prosise and we do all these amazing things with Deshaun Kaiser and we win the bowl game. Great. Okay. But that's not what's happening here. Okay. So I looked on average over those 5 games. Now, wait, you're going to say, no, they were only in 4. True. But I also count the 2020 ACC championship game as one of those big games, Notre Dame versus Clemson. The average margin of defeat in these 5 games, 2012, 2015, 2018, and 2 times in 2020, the average margin of defeat in all 5 games is over 3 touchdowns, 22.4 points negative. We run the ball on average less than 50%. And what did we say on this podcast? Hashtag RTDB, run the damn ball. And why do I say that? I say that because historically, over the last 10 years, the national champion will run the football 55 to 60%. Now, me personally, I'm more of a 60% plus kind of person, only because 3 things can happen when you pass and 2 of them are bad. Running the football tends to be okay. I believe it is a more risk-averse situation, especially in a game such as football, where field position and strategy and whatnot truly, truly matter. So, Notre Dame, in these defeats, do not run the ball over 50%, and that is a problem. Rushing yards is terrible. It's less than 100 yards on average. Yards per carry is less than 3 yards per carry. Total yards, we allow the opponent over 500 on average. Now, ironically, Alabama last year in the Rose Bowl in Texas was the least amount of yards we ever held a team in one of these games. Now, what's funny in kind of a bad way is the first time Notre Dame played Alabama in 2012 under Kelly, Alabama had 529 yards. Ouch. Yeah, not good. Our completion percentage is bad. We usually have more than one turnover. We get sacked a lot and tackled for loss on average 7 times. The worst was in 2020. Ian Book was sacked 6 times with 10 tackles for loss for the team. So not good there, Bob. Not good. Time of possession, of course, not good. But here's the stat. Yards per point. On average, our opponent has a yards for every point of 14.3. Now, Notre Dame averages 34.4. It's absolutely terrible. The worst it ever was 2018, 82.7 yards per point. Notre Dame versus Clemson, a loss of 30-3. Now, that is not the worst defeat Brian Kelly had. It was in 2012, the BCS championship game versus Alabama. I don't like bringing this up, but I think it's worth noting. It is a sign of what was to come with this guy. Losing by 28 points to Alabama, throwing the ball only 58% of the time, rushing for literally 32 yards. What the hell? Okay, look, we don't need to keep stabbing ourselves with needles here going through these stats. But if you're LSU, why the hell did you hire this man? Don't get me wrong, I'm actually really glad, because it's like, good, get him out of here, Now, I also said that I do think this is Notre Dame's best opportunity to win one of these big games. And Oklahoma State, they're not a pushover, and we'll do more of an analysis next week on them. But I'm really surprised that Kelly left at this time. He really could have stayed, kind of righted some wrongs. I really think he should have left after the bowl game just to be classy, and Notre Dame still could have kept Marcus Freeman, most likely, and made him their head coach, and Kelly could have gone to LSU, but no, he's an unclassy piece of trash who now has a Southern accent. So Kelly, look, I don't wish harm upon you, right? I'm mostly just disappointed, and now that I'm a parent, I can say that I'm disappointed in you. I did not expect this from him, to be so abrupt and so classless at a place that you were there for 11 full seasons and in your 12th, and that's how you leave. That's how you treat the people you've been around for all these years. Quite frankly, you're a douchebag. All right, shame on you. It is classless. Have some maturity, have some class, and leave better. All right. The players, you can tell they're happy that Kelly's gone. Their understanding of the business, and yes, you got a bunch of money and shit, but you know what? Your reputation is forever soiled. And unless you go to LSU and you do all these great things, but honestly, you have zero track record of doing so. You've been set in your ways for many years, and I just don't see it happening. So go Wildcats, beat Tigers, go Kansas State. Yeah. Next, I wanted to discuss, now that Marcus Freeman's at the helm, we're going to put BK behind us. But I wanted to look at the other head coaches that Notre Dame has had over the last few years and how they did in their first game. Now, Marcus Freeman is going to be in the biggest spotlight of, I think, any head coach that's taken over, certainly in recent years. But let's look at this. BK, his first game in 2010 was against Purdue, which was a win by 11 points. Charlie Weiss scored the most points in recent years, beating Pitt 42-21 at Pittsburgh. Tyrone Willingham allowed the least amount of points for his opponent by winning 22-0 against Maryland. Bob Davie eked out a win 17-13 versus Georgia Tech. And Lou Holtz, of this list, I didn't go beyond Lou Holtz, but Lou Holtz actually lost his first game that he ever coached at Notre Dame, which was a 23-24 defeat to Michigan, who is now in the playoffs, which really burns my ass. But quite frankly, they kind of deserve to be there. Now, if you take another step forward and say, okay, well, that's game 1. What about the next 4 games? So in the first 5 games, the records go as follows. BK was 2-3. Weiss was 4-1. Willingham was 5-0. Bob Davie 1-4. And Holtz was also 1-4 in his first 5 games. So, can we really conclude anything? I mean, let's face it. In 2002, we were all high as a kite when Tyrone Willingham took the team 8-0. It was quite remarkable, quite spectacular. And I'm very impressed, everyone was, with Charlie Weiss, because we were 4-1, and then we went and had the Bush Push game right after that, which was one of the most amazing games I've ever seen. Granted, we lost. But BK 2-3, White, Davie 1-4, and even Holtz 1-4. So, and Holtz is one of my favorite coaches at Notre Dame. So, can we really conclude a whole lot from the first couple of games? No, we cannot, because history and trends, they really do not, play out. It's really by the end of year 2, going into year 3, where you start really seeing, okay, is there really a momentum and a trend going on here, or is he still getting his feet wet, still plugging along? Notre Dame didn't really look great or spectacular until 1988, Holtz's 3rd year, right? So if you also look at this another way, though, is when did these coaches win titles? Well, none of the past 4 coaches won a title at Notre Dame. BK got close once and got boat raced by the Maroon team. But Holtz, in his 3rd year, took him 3 years to win a title. Now, I took this analysis and went further. Ever since 2005, Mac Brown, it took him 8 years at Texas until he won a title. Urban Meyer, his first title was in 2006 at Florida. He had been there 2 years. Les Miles at LSU, 2007, 3 years before winning his first title. Nick Saban's first title at Alabama now was in 2009. It took him 3 seasons, and he had to turn a program around pretty quickly. Gene Chizik, well, granted, if anyone has Cam Newton, you'll win the title. But for argument's sake, it was 2 years. Jimbo Fisher, with another Heisman Trophy winning quarterback, took him 4 years. Urban Meyer, Ohio State, 3 years. Now, that first year, they went 12-0, which was 2012. But if you recall, they were still coming off of the postseason ban from the Tressel era. So that first season would have been really interesting under Urban Meyer had there not been those sanctions against Ohio State. So that's a little asterisk there on the Urban Meyer one. Dabo Swinney at Clemson, took him 9 years. In recent years, quote unquote, he's the longest. Ogeron at LSU, 4 years. And that's it. So 3, 4 tends to be kind of the trend here. There's a couple guys with 2s. Jim Tressel was 2 years, for example. It's really remarkable to see how quickly a new coach can give the team a shot in the arm, get a couple of good recruits, and boom, you're hitting the ground running. So we'll see what Marcus Freeman does. I still am confident with the way he is making this team gel and the positivity, all the things we talked about last week with West Coast Irish. I really, really think that Marcus Freeman will win a title in under 4 years. So take that for what it is. So to Coach Freeman, good luck. Now the Twitter shout out this week. It's going to be very random, but something I do enjoy seeing is going to at Johnny W Boxing. Johnny, thank you for your Twitter friendship. but you tend to also be showing that like you're putting something delicious on the grill, or you're smoking, Cornish game hens or a, pork butt or something. You're always cooking delicious food, and you're also inspiring my dinner every now and then. So, to Johnny W Boxing, a good follow on Twitter, and also tends to, if anyone is into boxing, it's actually the really only the form of fighting I really enjoy watching, because I like there's more rules, and MMA and Ultimate Fighting. Okay, it does have its place, but I prefer boxing and just how it's a little more strategy, and it seems. That's just my opinion. So Johnny W Boxing, you're the Twitter shout out. Thank you, sir. Shalante. All right, the real reason why everyone's listening to this podcast, why Notre Dame did not make the playoffs, or should Notre Dame had made the playoffs. So this can be a controversial subject. You can kind of see what is or is not going on in the playoff committee. Personally, I think there's a little bit of bias and a lot of BCS love. But what did I say last week? I said that two things needed to happen. We needed someone like Oklahoma State to lose, which did happen to Baylor. And we needed one other team at least above them to lose. Now, I was hoping it would be Alabama that would lose and be out of the playoffs. Georgia would remain as number 1. Michigan most likely is 2, Cincinnati 3, and then Notre Dame would slide in to be number 4, and Notre Dame would make the playoffs. Now, that didn't happen because Alabama owns Georgia still to this day, and they got smacked around and said, no, we are still in charge of the SEC. Get to the back of the bus. Although they didn't get to the back of the bus, they're just only on ranked number 3, and now Cincinnati is going to be playing against Alabama. Now, Michigan completely exposed Iowa for the JV high school team that they are. They looked awful. Now, funny story is on Saturday, since Notre Dame wasn't playing, wife and we went to the Indianapolis Art Museum. And they have, Christmas lights up on the trees, and they have this festival called Winter Lights, and it's really an excuse to just stand around in the cold and drink beer and look at Christmas lights. So there you go. But on our way up there, in order to avoid traffic and avoid construction, we take the freeway and then we get off downtown. Now, I didn't plan this out ahead of time and didn't really have much foresight and foreshadowing, and we round the corner and I see Lucas Oil Stadium, and I'm like, the lights are on, what's going on? Oh shit, the Big Ten championship game is tonight. Damn it. Well, we're probably gonna be late, and we were a little delayed. It wasn't too bad. The game started after 8 o'clock, and it was about 5:30 by the time we got there. So there was some people tailgating, and it wasn't too crazy crowded. So I think we got there just before the wave, but drove by the stadium. I didn't give any Hawaiian good luck signs, and that's the middle finger, to any Michigan people. Figured I would avoid that since we had the baby in the car. But I made the mistake of driving by a very large stadium in downtown Indianapolis on the way to the art museum on the night of a big game. So I take full responsibility for my actions on that one. But anyway, Notre Dame does not make the playoffs. Cincinnati won. Michigan won. Alabama won. And I predicted that this would happen. If Alabama wins, Georgia loses, they would remain in the playoffs, and they would be 3 or 4. And look, that's what happened. Now, I'm not surprised also that the committee put Georgia as number 3 based on transitive property. And let's face it, college football, the TV, and all this stuff, there's money involved. So Georgia will want to... The committee does not want Georgia and Alabama to play again in the first round because they just played for an SEC championship game. That doesn't make it very interesting, quote unquote. Now, I think if they really wanted to make it interesting, they would throw Notre Dame in it because they have a new coach and they are 11-1. And why not? Okay, you could have Marcus Freeman play Alabama for the first, game. Now, the argument, should Michigan be number 1 versus Alabama? Now, I think if Alabama and Georgia, that game was closer, then maybe they would have done that based on this quote-unquote eye test BS, because Michigan completely dominated Iowa, but I think Iowa's weak, and let's face it, I don't want to see Michigan as number 1. I never want to even see them win. But then you have to ask yourself, well, wait a second. Look at Cincinnati. Of this group, they're the only team with a perfect record. Yet still, they are left out. So why is Cincinnati not the number 1 team in the country? Well, the reason for that is their strength of schedule. If you look at Alabama, Michigan, Georgia, Cincinnati, and then Notre Dame, of these teams, they have the worst strength of schedule. Per Sagarin is 82nd. Now, if you expand this analysis further to all 12 teams that are playing in New Year's Sixes, Pittsburgh, Utah, Michigan State, Oklahoma State, Ole Miss, Baylor, etc., they still have the worst strength of schedule. Second worst is Pitt at 69. Notre Dame's sitting at 41. So based off of that and the quality of competition and the record of their competition, they do not deserve to be better. Alabama, their strength of schedule, 7. Now they're getting bumped up a lot because Georgia was undefeated. They were 12-0 going into that game, and now they're 12-1. But let's face it, Michigan is also 12-1. And Michigan and Georgia are roughly similar strength of schedules, 31 and 35 respectively. But should Notre Dame have made the playoffs? So the only way I could see Notre Dame making this playoff is because Georgia lost so bad and they appeared to be imposters that they shouldn't make it. Let's put it another way. If Notre Dame was in that situation and lost really bad at the end of the season, would they have knocked Notre Dame out? Maybe. But let's look at what happened last year. Notre Dame was undefeated, had beaten Clemson head-to-head in the regular season. Then they go to the championship game, the ACC championship game, and lose quite handily at the hands of Clemson. Yet they still made the playoffs and played Alabama. So this actually what's happening here is very similar to what happened last year. You go to your championship game, you lose, but you were already ranked really high. I think Notre Dame was 2nd going into that game. And then you lose. And this is what happens. So what happened to Georgia, falling, but not falling too hard and remaining in the playoffs, is just what happened to Notre Dame last year. So should Notre Dame have made the playoffs? If you base it off of historical trends of the committee and then what happened to Notre Dame last year, the answer is no. Notre Dame would not make the playoffs. Now, I would also argue, because this show is powered by Scotch and spreadsheets, but the spreadsheet portion, if you look at all the stats that I usually talk about, most normal shows, the last 2 episodes have not been normal, but go 2 episodes before that, and what do I talk about? I talk about the most important stats in college football. I break down how every team is doing. When I compare next week, Oklahoma State, Notre Dame, I'm going to compare them side by side in all these categories. Offensive scores, defensive scores, total touchdowns, scoring defense, total defense, scoring offense, rushing touchdowns, rushing yards, etc. I will compare teams side by side and see how are you doing in these stats. And when you compare Notre Dame to the other 11 teams that are all going into their respective New Year's Six game or playoff game, Notre Dame is not one of the top 4 teams. They're actually not even close to the top 4 when you compare to those other teams. So what I did is I broke down the stats. There are about 20 of them, and they go as follows. National champions on average are 8th in the country. No, they're 6th in the country in total touchdowns. Right now, Pitt, of all teams, has more touchdowns than anyone else in the country. Alabama is 2nd. Notre Dame is 10th on this list. They're ranked 26th in the country, but they're behind Baylor, Ole Miss, Utah, Michigan, Georgia, etc. So they do not belong relative to the number 1 most important stat, which is total touchdowns scored. Now, defensive scoring defense, the number 1 team is, of course, Georgia. Now, Cincinnati is very good. They're 4th, but Notre Dame, 9th, not bad. Okay. Total defense, Notre Dame ranks 30th in the country. So what I do is I add up all these scores, defensive scores, offensive scores, and you add it up. And if you were number 1 in everything, you'd have a really low score. You'd be an amazing team. And they probably already hand you that Dr. Pepper trophy. But I'm looking at the total score, and you want a small score to be the best. Number 1 is Georgia, based off of primarily their defense, because their defensive score is not the best, but it's really good. But their offense isn't shabby either. They have a total score of 425. Next is Michigan, 474. Then Cincinnati, then Alabama. Notre Dame, 833. Now, where's Oklahoma State on this? Oklahoma State is 2 slots above Notre Dame, 671. Now, Notre Dame's offense and defense are also not better than Oklahoma State. So if I forget transitive property, if I ignore strength of schedule, if I even, quite frankly, ignore record, and I just look at stats, how teams are performing on the field, looking at the box score, Notre Dame is not the best team and is certainly not one of the best 4 teams. Now, can they still win? And there's a lot more going on than just reading stats off a spreadsheet. Sure. But it really justifies why Notre Dame is not in the playoffs. I would love them to be in the playoffs, but let's face it, they're not. But there is something Notre Dame does, and I talk about this every show: yards per point. It is the efficiency of your offense, the efficiency of your football team at putting points on the board relative to how you move the ball. And it's a very generalized stat, but it tends to be very revealing. And good teams always have a low yards per point. National champions, on average over the last 10 years, their yards per point is 11.71. Notre Dame this season, 11.79. It's very, very good. Now, there are 4 teams better than Notre Dame. So if you just look at yards per point, Notre Dame is exactly where they're supposed to be, 5th in the country. But the teams above them are Cincinnati, Georgia, Alabama, and then surprisingly, Pittsburgh. Michigan is just under Notre Dame at 11.99. So where's Oklahoma State? 13.13. So Notre Dame does have a more efficient offense. We will break down Notre Dame and Oklahoma State next week in detail, going line by line and looking at some of these other things. But the last time Notre Dame was in a Fiesta Bowl was against Ohio State. And the last time Oklahoma State was in the Fiesta Bowl was in 2012, where they beat Stanford 41-38 in an overtime thriller. And Mike Gundy beat David Shaw and Andrew Luck. So, look, Notre Dame's in a really good spot. We should feel really good about ourselves. This is kind of that weird dead period between the beginning of bowls, but do we really care about the first couple bowls, the Las Vegas Bowl, the, Bahamas Bowl or Sarsaparilla Bowl, whatever they're called, right? Do we really care about this? Nah, not really, But Christmas is coming, and, right now, Notre Dame's in a good spot. They're looking forward to the future. They're looking forward to the opportunity to not be in the playoffs this year. Let's look at it another way. If Notre Dame was in the playoffs, they'd be ranked 4th. They'd be playing most likely Alabama. Do we really want to play Alabama for Marcus Freeman's first game? I'm not going to answer that. I'll let you guys answer that. Comment on the show. Comment at me on Twitter at faithful_Irish. And, let me know what you think. So this is where we're at right now, team. Feel good about this. Notre Dame did not make the playoffs. I'm not going to say the committee got it right, but I can't find too many arguments that justify why Notre Dame should have been the playoffs. I know no one really wants to hear that, but I'm never going to bullshit anyone here. This is the hard truth. This is the reality. And if Notre Dame had beaten Cincinnati would totally be out. Notre Dame would probably be 2nd or 3rd in the country right now and be playing Michigan in the playoffs. So we have no one to blame but ourselves for the situation we are in now. Or we could blame Brian Kelly because he's not there anymore. So anyway. All right. Thank you everyone for joining me. Have a great rest of your week. Good luck with your Christmas shopping. It is coming up here. Christmas is coming. The goose is getting fat. All right. Take care, everyone. Good night. Shlante. Go Irish. Beat Advent.